A millionaire's paradise turned into a crime scene. What really happened to Joanna Simpson? Stay with me as we unravel a chilling tale of love, betrayal, and a terrifying disappearance.
Hey, everyone. Today, we're diving into another terrifying case. Make sure to support my channel by hitting that subscribe button and turning on notifications.
The English town of Ascot, best known for its horse racing and as the home of many millionaires, suddenly found itself in the spotlight for a very different reason. I invite you to listen to the story of Joanna Simpson. Joanna Simpson was born in 1964 to Diana Parks and Chris Simpson in York, Yorkshire. She attended York College for Girls before her family moved to Laxey on the Isle of Man after the sale of her father's building firm. There, Joanna attended the Buon School. After spending time at a grammar school in Oxford, she studied business at the University of Bath. She was always popular among her peers, kind, well-mannered, and optimistic. She was also very empathetic, always thinking of others and trying to help. Her personality meant that she was always surrounded by a group of people who loved spending time with her. Naturally, there were also men in her circle with whom she went on dates, but Joanna decided to marry in 1994 at the age of 30. Together with her husband, she bought a fairly large house in Ascot. Although at the time they did not really need such a big home, they had no children and lived there just the two of them. Joanna knew that Ascot was a popular location. It was close to Windsor, where the royal family's castle is located. Nearby there is also Legoland, all of which made the area a good base for accommodation. For this reason, Joanna planned to convert part of the house into a guest house. As you can see, she and her husband had shared plans. But despite her family's enthusiasm for the man she had married and what seemed to be a promising relationship, for some reason, the couple separated after just 3 years of marriage. Joanna was deeply affected by the breakdown of her marriage. Her friends could see that she was feeling down, so in an attempt to cheer her up, they suggested a trip to South Africa. One of her friends worked as a chief flight attendant and had a flight planned to that country. He thought it would be a good idea to take Joanna away from home. Perhaps in another country, far from England, she might stop thinking about what had happened, even if only for a short while. Joanna accepted the offer, and, as it turned out, the decision had a major impact on her life. During the trip, she met the man who would soon become her husband. Robert Brown worked for the same airline as Joanna's friend, but he was a pilot. There was an instant spark between Joanna and Robert, and soon he moved into the house she had kept after her divorce. Their relationship progressed at lightning speed. Robert moved in during September 1998, and by Christmas, he had proposed. He was convinced that Joanna was the love of his life and that she was the woman he wanted to spend the rest of his days with. A mere 6 weeks after their engagement, in February 1999, the couple walked down the aisle. Joanna's family was shocked by how quickly everything was happening. They could not quite understand the rush. After all, the couple had barely got to know each other. Joanna's parents had met Robert only a few times, and he had not made the best impression on them. They found him arrogant and lacking in warmth. They could not see what their daughter saw in him or understand why she was so eager to marry him after only a few months. Both Joanna and Robert were adults who knew what they were doing. It was their decision to make. The only thing Joanna's parents could do was advise her to sign a prenuptial agreement before the wedding. They had a feeling that this marriage would not last long, and they did not want their daughter to have to worry about dividing assets in the future. It did not take long for their concerns to be justified. At their wedding, which was attended by just over 20 guests, the couple seemed happy. But immediately after the ceremony, they set off on their honeymoon to the country where they had first met. They returned to South Africa, and Joanna hoped they would have an unforgettable time. However, once there, she saw a completely different side to Robert. His behavior towards the hotel staff shocked her. She had never seen him be so rude to another person before. It turned out that she did not know him as well as she had thought. Perhaps the decision to marry had been made too hastily. During the trip, when Joanna called her mother, she was already saying that she had made a mistake, that she should not have married this man. She had probably misjudged him. Joanna was not happy as she watched her newlywed husband's behavior during their honeymoon. However, even though she already suspected that marrying him had been the wrong decision, she did not end the marriage immediately. She believed she could change Robert. She also had another reason to stay in the marriage. Shortly after returning from South Africa, Joanna discovered she was expecting a baby. Like many women in her situation, she thought that having a child might change her husband, that perhaps once he became a father, he would see the world differently and soften his attitude. Robert did not change. He remained the same arrogant, ill-tempered man, rude even to Joanna's friends. They never knew what mood he would be in or how he would treat them. It hurt Joanna to see how he behaved around her friends, but she could not bring herself to leave him. She wanted her son, Alex, to have a complete family. A few months after Alex was born, Joanna became pregnant again. 17 months after their son arrived, she gave birth to a daughter, Katie. The second child did nothing to alter Robert's behavior. He never physically harmed his wife, but Joanna's friends could see how deeply his actions upset her. The couple were so different that many people must have wondered what had ever drawn them together. They appeared to have nothing in common. They never spent time together, never went anywhere as a couple. Had it not been for the children, whom Joanna wanted to grow up with both parents in their lives, she would likely have filed for divorce soon after their wedding. Turned out to be inevitable. After 8 years of marriage, Joanna realized she could not go on like this. She did not want to waste her life in a relationship with Robert. So in 2007, she filed for divorce. At that point, her husband's behavior became even worse. It was no longer just about his unpleasantness towards her and her loved ones. Robert began telling her things that left her unsure of how to react. He spoke about wanting to take his own life, but at times he also hinted at thoughts of harming Joanna and their children. Joanna did not know whether to take his words seriously or if he was simply trying to manipulate her, saying these things to make her withdraw the divorce petition. She knew that despite their troubled marriage, Robert did not actually want her to leave him. He wanted to have a wife and children by his side. If they divorced, his job, which often took him abroad for up to a week at a time, meant that the children would primarily live with Joanna. He would have far less contact with them, something he was unwilling to accept. Yet he also seemed incapable of changing his behavior enough to make Joanna reconsider the divorce. The couple was still living together when something happened that made Joanna realize just how dangerous her husband truly was. One evening, after they had put the children to bed, an argument broke out. It was not the first time Robert had accused Joanna of having an affair. It was not true, and she tried to explain that to him, but he grew increasingly agitated. At one point, he grabbed a kitchen knife, stepped towards her, and pressed it against her throat, declaring that he was going to kill her. Joanna was terrified, but she tried to stay calm. Speaking in a steady voice, she told him that what he was about to do made no sense. She knew how much he cared about their children, so she reminded him that if he killed her, they would be left without parents, as he would end up in prison. Only then did Robert let her go. Joanna confided in her mother and her friends about what had happened. They all told her she needed to report it to the police, that she could not simply let it go because Robert was unpredictable and dangerous. But Joanna refused. She knew that if Robert were arrested, it would have a huge impact on their children, and she did not want to put them through that. That evening had made one thing clear. She could no longer live with him. She was afraid of him. The only solution was for Robert to move out. But he had no intention of leaving. He was offered money that would allow him to buy a flat, but he refused to accept it, perhaps hoping that with each refusal, he would be offered an even better deal. He knew that Joanna came from a wealthy family and that they could afford a lot. For a long time, he refused all offers, but eventually he relented and moved out. Joanna could finally breathe a sigh of relief. While the couple waited for their divorce to be finalized, they shared custody of the children, which meant they had to stay in contact. However, Joanna tried to keep their communication to an absolute minimum. She didn't want Robert to think there was still any connection between them. Everything seemed to be improving. They were living separately, and Robert had even started seeing another woman, who, after some time, became pregnant. Joanna genuinely hoped that his new relationship and the baby on the way would change him somehow, that he would finally focus on his own life and let her concentrate on hers. But on the 1st of November, 2010, the police received a call from a man who was reluctant to say too much about what had happened. He only wanted to know what time he could come to the station to discuss an incident that had taken place the previous day. He was very secretive, carefully choosing his words to avoid revealing too much. He also refused to let the police come to his house, as was standard in such cases, claiming that he had 4 children in his care and didn't want to cause them unnecessary stress. It was highly unusual, but a time was set for him to come in. That man was Robert Brown. Around the same time that he called the police, one of Joanna's friends received a call from the school her children attended. It was a Monday, and neither Alex nor Katie had turned up after the half-term break. The school tried calling Joanna, but she wasn't answering. Unfortunately, her friend didn't know exactly where she might be. In late October, schools in England have a one-week holiday, and she knew Alex and Katie had planned to spend it with their father. Meanwhile, Joanna had planned to fly to the Isle of Man to visit her parents. She wasn't expected to extend her trip, as the children were due back at school on Monday. Concerned after the call from the school, Joanna's friend rang her mother to check if she was still at her parents' house. But Joanna's mother told her she had already returned to Ascot. She hadn't spoken to her that day, and when she tried calling after the conversation, Joanna didn't answer. This worried both women so much that they decided to call the police. Since it was already known that Joanna's husband had requested a meeting with the police regarding an incident at their home, concerns grew that something might have happened to her. Several officers were sent to the 46-year-old's house. The property appeared empty. No one responded to persistent knocking on the doors and windows. Eventually, the police decided to enter the house. As soon as they stepped inside, they noticed bloodstains in the hallway. This was extremely alarming, especially as Joanna was nowhere to be found. She was not in the house or anywhere on the property. No one knew where she might be, and no one had been able to contact her. The police hoped that when Robert arrived at the station, they would learn more about what had happened. But when he showed up and was questioned, he responded to every inquiry with no comment. No one could understand his behavior. After all, he had been the one to contact the police and request a meeting. Now, when given the opportunity to speak, he refused to answer even a single question. It made no sense. But no matter how the investigators phrased their questions, Robert remained silent. With Joanna still missing, he was taken into custody. Meanwhile, the search for her began. Since her house was surrounded by 2 acres of land that also belonged to her, the police started their search there. According to her family and friends, Joanna would never abandon her children and leave without explanation. Something must have happened, which is why everyone feared the worst from the outset. They suspected that Robert had killed her. The only information established on the first day was the whereabouts of Alex and Katie. It turned out that Robert had taken them to his brother's house. The question remained, what had happened to Joanna? The only person who probably knew the answer continued to say nothing. On the 2nd of November, the police attempted to question Robert again. Every time they asked about the events of the 31st of October, he consistently replied, no comment. So the investigators decided to change their approach. They started asking him about other topics, his hobbies, his work. Suddenly, Robert was much more willing to talk. He eagerly discussed how much he enjoyed running, how he tried to do it every day, and what his goals were related to it. Robert had no hesitation in talking about his relationship with Joanna, although he constantly tried to paint her in a bad light. He considered her to be a spoiled child. She had grown up in a family that never lacked money, and her parents always gave her whatever she wished for. It was clear that he did not like her family, as if he resented them simply because they were wealthier than his own parents. He himself came from a modest family living in Edinburgh. His father worked at the port, while his mother was a bank employee. They never struggled to cover basic expenses, but they were nowhere near the financial level of Joanna and her family. However, that was all in the past. Working as a pilot, Robert earned £150,000 a year. He certainly had no reason to complain about a lack of money. Yet for some reason, he remained bothered by the fact that his wife had come from a wealthier background than he had. Investigators thought that after Robert had opened up a little about himself, he might also answer questions regarding Joanna. But despite being willing to talk about everything else, as soon as they asked him about what had happened on the last day of October, they heard the same response as before. No comment. Robert explained that his mind seemed to refuse to allow him to answer those questions. Since he was unwilling to cooperate with the police or tell them what had happened to his wife, investigators continued to gather as much information as possible. They conducted a thorough search of Joanna's house and determined that, in addition to the blood initially discovered in the hallway, there were also small blood stains on the carpet in the room closest to the entrance. Similar traces were found in 2 locations outside the house. Samples were taken for analysis, which later confirmed that the blood belonged to Joanna. They kept asking themselves, why would Robert kill her? They had separated 3 years earlier, and he had already started building a life with another woman. Why now? The ongoing investigation uncovered a possible motive for the crime. From the very beginning of his relationship with Joanna, Robert had been obsessed with her wealth. He did not know exactly how much money she had or what assets she owned. Before their wedding, he had signed a prenuptial agreement, which theoretically meant it should not have concerned him. However, since their relationship had been troubled almost from the start, Joanna never shared financial details with him. It later emerged that even after Robert had moved out of her house, he often returned there when she was away. He had persuaded the children to give him the new security code for the alarm, which allowed him to enter whenever he pleased and go through his wife's documents. He became obsessed. He believed that Joanna had vast sums of money in various accounts. He even thought she might have up to £25 million. In theory, he had no claim to that money. However, at the time, English law did not recognize prenuptial agreements, which changed the situation somewhat. The contract they had signed before their marriage would have been invalid. Everything changed on the 20th of October, 2010. From that day onwards, under the new legal provisions in England, prenuptial agreements were taken into account. This meant that if Joanna and Robert's divorce was finalized, he would receive nothing from her fortune, unless the divorce never happened. Their next court hearing was scheduled for the 8th of November, and there was a high probability that the divorce proceedings would be concluded on that date. Was this why Robert killed Joanna a week earlier? Unfortunately, the man still refused to say a single word about what had happened to his wife that day. Joanna and Robert were not alone in the house. Alex and Katie had spent the entire half-term holiday with their father, and on Sunday, the 31st of October, he was supposed to bring them back to Joanna's home. She had been looking forward to it. She had not seen them for a whole week and wanted to give them a warm welcome. She baked a chocolate cake and prepared their favorite meal. Normally, whenever Robert was to bring the children home, Joanna asked one of her friends to be there as well, but that day she had no one to ask. It was the school holidays and all her friends had traveled somewhere. For the first time, she waited alone for Robert and the children to arrive. Investigators knew that the children had been in the house when an argument broke out between their parents. Since they could not get any information from Robert, they decided to speak to the children instead. That was when they learned that shortly after arriving home, their parents had started arguing. The argument quickly escalated into physical violence. The children couldn't see what was happening in the other room, but they could hear noises coming from there. At one point, they heard loud thudding sounds. They didn't know what it was, but moments later, they saw Robert carrying Joanna and placing her in the boot of his car. He told them he had to take her to the hospital because she was injured. He also ordered them to get into the car and drove them back to his house. Later that night, he left again and didn't return until 7 a.m. But by then, Joanna was no longer with him. Since he had arrived at his wife's house at around 4 p.m., this meant he had been away for several hours. What had he done with Joanna during that time? Robert refused to provide any information about what had happened to his wife. He was questioned 9 times, and each interrogation followed the same pattern. He was willing to talk about himself and his relationship with Joanna, but remained silent about what had happened when he went to her house on the 31st of October. Eventually, during one of the interrogations, he asked to speak privately with his solicitor. After about 20 minutes, they returned to the interview room. The solicitor read out a statement from Robert in which he admitted to killing Joanna. According to what he wrote, they had argued about something related to the children's schooling, and at some point, he lost control. The only thing he remembered was pushing her, but he claimed not to recall what happened next. He vaguely recalled that Joanna was injured and that he wanted to take her to the hospital. But after dropping off Alex and Katie at his house, he realized she was already dead. At that point, he panicked and decided to hide her body in the woods. Robert offered to show the investigators where he had hidden it. When they arrived at the site, it became clear that the body had been so well concealed that it would have been nearly impossible to find, even if the area had been searched. It was evident that Robert had gone to great lengths to ensure it would never be discovered. First, he had buried it in a location nearly 1.2 miles from the nearest road. Second, he had carefully leveled the ground and covered it with leaves, so there was no visible sign of recent digging. When investigators began to excavate the spot, they uncovered a large plastic storage container, the kind typically used for keeping garden tools. Inside was Joanna's body. When the investigators considered the amount of effort it must have taken Robert to dig such a large hole, especially in a wooded area where digging is not easy, the fact that he had to transport the heavy container in his car, and the meticulous way he had disguised the burial site so that there were no visible signs of fresh soil, they concluded that he must have prepared everything in advance. He wouldn't have been able to do all this in just the few hours he was unaccounted for. Moreover, the soil around the container was packed tightly against its sides, suggesting that it had been buried there for some time. There was also no sign of the excess soil. Robert would have removed an estimated 400 kilograms, 880 pounds of soil. This indicated that he had likely disposed of it elsewhere. Investigators suspected that Robert had dug the hole beforehand, placed the container inside, and had everything ready. For the moment he took Joanna's life, this theory was further supported by statements from their children. When they later visited the burial site to lay flowers, they revealed that they knew the place very well. They had often gone there with their father and even had a secret hideout nearby. The last time they had been there was during the autumn holiday, just 1 week before their mother's death. Despite this evidence, Robert continued to deny that he had planned Joanna's murder. He insisted that everything that happened that day was the result of a sudden loss of control. He claimed that the stress of the 3-year-long divorce proceedings had left him in a fragile mental state. He was diagnosed with an adjustment disorder, a condition triggered by stress, considered a milder form of post-traumatic stress disorder. He insisted he hadn't known what he was doing. But was that really true? If he hadn't planned anything, why had he taken a hammer with him when he went to Joanna's house? He later admitted that he had hidden it in one of the children's bags. The post-mortem examination revealed that Joanna had been struck at least 14 times with a blunt object, most likely a hammer. If the killing wasn't premeditated, why had he brought the weapon with him? Further evidence of prior planning was found inside the buried container. Along with Joanna's body, investigators discovered rubber gloves, plastic shoe covers, and a protective suit. He must have purchased these items in advance, which strongly suggested that he had planned everything beforehand. In May 2011, when the trial in this case began, it seemed that there could be only one verdict, that Robert would be found guilty of murdering Joanna. However, when the jury returned to the courtroom, what everyone heard shocked them. The jury ruled that Robert was not guilty of murdering Joanna. What had happened was deemed involuntary manslaughter. He had dug a deep hole in the forest, transported a specially prepared box to that location, and placed it in the hole, intending to hide Joanna's body there. Then, he went to her house with a hammer. All of this suggested premeditation. Yet the jury's decision reflected a different interpretation of events. They accepted that Robert had not intended to kill Joanna, but had lost control in the heat of the moment. His sentence, therefore, was significantly lighter than what a murder conviction would have carried. The public reaction was one of outrage. Many believed that the verdict did not reflect the gravity of Robert's actions, especially considering the elaborate planning involved in concealing the body. Legal experts debated whether the jury had been swayed by his emotional state or by the claim that he had suffered from an adjustment disorder. Joanna's family, devastated by the verdict, vowed to fight for justice. They believed that Robert had meticulously planned the murder and that the legal system had failed them. In interviews, Joanna's relatives described her as a devoted mother who had endured years of conflict with Robert during their divorce. They argued that his history of controlling behavior and the careful concealment of the crime pointed to a premeditated act rather than an impulsive loss of control. Despite the court's ruling, the case remained a chilling example of how justice can sometimes fall short in the face of a well-crafted legal defense. Many continued to question, had the legal system truly served justice, or had it simply allowed a calculated killer to escape the full weight of his crime? Occurring just 10 days after England enacted a law recognizing prenuptial agreements, which meant he would not receive a penny of his wife's money after killing her, He returned home to disconnect the landline phone and uninstall the cameras, which had likely recorded him carrying Joanna to the car. Despite all of this, the jury decided to acquit him of murder charges. Joanna's family and friends could not believe what they had just heard, and shock was evident on the faces of everyone in the courtroom. Even the judge could not hide his surprise. Had Robert been convicted of murder, he would have received a life sentence. But for involuntary manslaughter, the maximum penalty he could face was 26 years. And that was exactly the sentence the judge handed down. On May 24th, the jury concluded that Brown was not guilty of murder, but guilty of manslaughter. He was sentenced to 26 years in prison, 24 years for manslaughter, and an additional 2 years for obstructing a coroner. In practice, this meant that he would serve 13 years in prison, followed by 13 years under police supervision while on parole. Under these terms, Robert could have been released in November 2023. In 2023, Brown was due to be released on parole after serving half of his sentence. However, former Justice Secretary Alex Chalk referred the case to the parole board in October 2023 to assess whether Brown could be safely released from prison, effectively blocking his automatic release. This action followed a high-profile campaign led by Joanna Simpson's mother, Diana Parks, and her friend Hetty Barkworth Nanton. Their efforts aimed to reform laws and sentencing related to murder and manslaughter, and to keep Brown behind bars. They also established the Joanna Simpson Foundation, which supports children affected by domestic abuse and homicide. Brown appealed the government's decision, but the High Court dismissed it. Mr. Justice Ritchie noted that there were good grounds for believing Brown posed a high risk to the public of serious harm and required a full and proper assessment. At the time, Ms. Parks stated, "I am pleased that the decision has been made to block Robert Brown's appeal against the judicial review judgment. The denial of Brown's appeal has shown that the High Court made the right decision in agreeing with the Secretary of State for Justice in using the powers to block the automatic release of my daughter's killer. We now hope the parole board will recognize how dangerous Brown is and will not release him." In January 2025, Ms. Parks and Ms. Barkworth Nanton met with Deputy Prime Minister Angela Rayner and the Secretary of State for Justice, Shabana Mahmood MP, to discuss the Law Commission's review of homicide laws and sentencing for murder. The review presented proposals for reform, but both women stated that the plans failed to go far enough to protect victims of domestic abuse. Many people often wonder, what happened to the children? Katie and Alex were only 9 and 10 years old when their mother was killed. Ms. Parks, Joanna's mother, has said that she was the one who had to tell the children about their mother's death. She recalled, "I had the job of telling the children that Mommy had been found, and she hadn't survived." Reflecting on that terrible moment, she previously said, "It was the worst day of my life. Obviously, it was terrible." After their mother's death, the children lived with Ms. Parks on the Isle of Wight. She said her grandchildren gave her purpose after losing her daughter. In newly released police tapes, an ITV documentary features young Katie describing what she witnessed on October 31st, 2010. Extremely distressed and sobbing, Katie tells an interviewer that she does not know where her dad took her mom. "They got into a fight and they were hitting each other," Katie said. "And then Dad put Mom in the car and said he had hurt her. He said he was taking Mom to the hospital, but I don't know what happened. He came back at 7 in the morning, but I don't know about Mom." To this day, Joanna's loved ones continue their fight for justice, ensuring her story is not forgotten. While Brown remains behind bars, her family and friends work tirelessly to protect other victims of domestic abuse. Through the Joanna Simpson Foundation, they honor her memory, turning their grief into a force for change. "Hello, police emergency line. How can I help you?" A deep breath, then hesitation. I need to book an appointment. It's urgent." The officer on the other end of the line picked up on the unease in the caller's voice. "Okay, sir. Can you tell me what's going on?" "I've spoken to my lawyer and he advised me not to say anything." That caught the officer's attention. People don't usually start calls like this unless something big was at play. "Can I ask why he told you that?" A long pause, then a reluctant confession. "The incident, it's of a serious nature." The officer's tone shifted slightly, more firm now. "When you say serious, I need to understand just how serious. That will determine how quickly I pass this to an officer." Can you tell me more? I really don't want to say anything over the phone. I understand, but this is confidential. Just between you and me right now. Another pause. A shaky exhale. It's extremely serious. Does this involve your ex-partner? Yes. And did the incident happen recently? Yes. Last night. Are you both okay? Any injuries? A beat of silence. Then the truth cracked through. One person is hurt. The officer straightened. Do they need medical attention? No. Are there children involved? Yeah, but they're with me. They're safe. My girlfriend is looking after them. The officer noted this down, processing the layers of the situation. Just to clarify, your girlfriend isn't the one involved in this, is she? It's my ex-wife. The pieces were falling into place, but something still didn't feel right. I'm assuming you're reaching out because you're worried about the consequences? A slow, heavy yes. The officer shifted gears, ready to move this forward. All right, let's get some details. Can I start with your name? Robert Brown. And your address? Springfield, North Street. Postcode SL44 quote. Thank you. And the name of your ex-wife? Joanna. And her date of birth? A pause. 1965. No, wait. 1964. The officer kept writing, their mind racing ahead. Something was off about Robert's voice. The hesitations, the slight mistakes. He was rattled, nervous, possibly guilty. All right, Robert, you mentioned you want to come to the station. If I can get you an appointment today, would that work for you? Absolutely, yes. Okay, hold the line. Let me check our availability. As the seconds stretched into minutes, Robert tapped his fingers against the table. His breathing was uneven. The air around him felt suffocating. His mind replayed the events of the previous night in flashes, shouting, struggling, something breaking, and then silence. Then the officer's voice cut back in. All right, Robert, here's what we're going to do. Due to the nature of what you've told me, I want you to head to Windsor Police Station as soon as possible. We're going to have an officer meet you there. A lump formed in Robert's throat. It was happening. No turning back now. Do I need a lawyer with me? That's up to you, Robert, but I suggest you come in soon. We need to talk. Click. The line went dead. Robert sat there staring at his phone, his heart pounding. The walls were closing in.